Thank you, Sanyu, for your kind words. So we'll begin the first session in this series. It's on American inequality in the age of the pandemic. There's nothing like a good crisis to reveal the cracks and fissures in any society. That happened with Hurricane Katrina, it happened during the Great Recession, and it's happening again now. And here to reflect on it, we have three very talented and qualified people, three professors at Princeton and a respondent from Washington University in St. Louis. From Princeton, we have Keith Whaley, the Henry Putnam University Professor of History. From Princeton, we also have Marta Tienda, the Morris B. During Class of 22 Professor in Demographic Studies, and Matthew Desmond, the Morris B. During Professor of Sociology. Our respondent will be Jeff K. Ward, Professor of African and African American Studies at St. Louis University, Washington University in St. Louis. So we'll go right into the program. Each speaker will speak about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a short time for responses, and then we'll open the floor to some further discussion. So we begin with Keith Whaley.
Great. Thank you, Sanyu, for the opening remarks, and also thank you to Doug for your introduction. As Doug explained, I'm a historian and I guess a historian and sociologist of science. And what I thought I would speak about today is what the question of epidemics and social inequality looks like through the lens of history. Epidemics, as Doug says, both reveal inequalities and aggravate them. That's a truism in my field, in the history of medicine and the history of public health. They can also, in revealing these inequalities and in the wake of their disruptions and devastation, bring about modest and sometimes dramatic sweeping social change. The question of what kind of inequalities are revealed and what society makes of those revelations depends really on a lot of details. The details of the disease itself, its duration, the expansiveness of the social turmoil it creates, the nature of the disruptions, and the underlying, you might say, pre-existing social dynamics. In many ways, COVID-19 has become a case in point of a broad set of truisms and challenges. In my brief remarks, what I thought I would do is just illustrate some of those understandings of the inequalities that are revealed, aggravated, and possibly acted upon, positively or not, by looking at past pandemics, past epidemics, and in relationship to social change. What I thought I would do very, very quickly is take you on a whirlwind tour through not just the history of plague and cholera, influenza, and non-epidemic diseases like tuberculosis, typhus, but also some of the literature, which in some ways speaks to, that truism from William Faulkner, to paraphrase, the past isn't prologue, it's not even past. So with that in mind, let me just say that, my point of reflection is articles like this, which announced, this was November of last year, that US had surpassed 11 million infections, and that this is still true today, Black and Latino Americans still burden a shoulder and outsized share of the burden. And this particular article in the New York Times pointed to some of the factors that is still important for us today. Higher positivity rates among particular groups, Latinx, American Indian, African American populations, but also the essential work dynamic, the fact that many of these populations work in food service, home health, non-remote work not as available to them, and work deemed essential like in meatpacking plants that put them in harm's way. And then we also had the phenomenon of multi-generational households where the deadly efficiency of the spread of this communicable disease is far more obvious. Now, just to reflect on what this situation looks like from the standpoint of history, I'll say much of it is familiar, that pandemics reveal social inequalities. And his Chronicle of the Bubonic Plague in 1665, London, Daniel Defoe, looking back at the plague many years later, observed that the infection kept chiefly in the out parishes, which, being very populous and fuller, alas, of the poor, the distemper found more to prey upon than in the city. And here you have a kind of a different social configuration of city life in which poverty is associated with the suburbs, with the out parishes, in contrast to the well-to-do inner city. In the US, we can point to this as a recurring story of social location driving higher mortality among the poor or disproportionate suffering during pandemics. This was true certainly in the wave of cholera epidemics that really defined much of public health and social life in 19th century America. Cholera has long been seen as a case study for thinking about epidemics and social inequality and social change, a disease that swept across Europe, really starting in Asia, swept across Europe and reached American shores for the first time in the 1830s, and is seen as inflicting its deadliest harm among those inhabiting the most populous and central portions of the city. It's there that you see one of those early American conversations about epidemics being shocking revealers of social inequalities, drivers of new disparities, and rallying cries for reform. In a classic book, The Cholera Years, written by Charles Rosenberg, who's my academic PhD advisor a number of years ago, Charles wrote that to Americans, the extent of poverty revealed by the epidemic was genuinely disturbing in 1832 and 1849. He quotes a Cincinnati editor as observing that if the disease was caused by poor food, poor lodging, and filth and intemperance, a major concern at this time, the number of victims gives us a melancholy idea of the present state of society. And it's by 1866, by the 1860s, that cholera becomes not just a basis for bemoaning social inequalities, but a rallying cry for doing something about it. It takes 3 cholera epidemics before people begin to think through what is possible in terms of building a public health system that focuses on prevention, creating a permanent Metropolitan Board of Health entrusted with the care and well-being of the population. So you might say that epidemics like this can reveal social inequalities, but they also can lay the basis for pretty dramatic and sustained social change in terms of questions of governance and how we manage our public health. A much more pessimistic story of social inequality and epidemic disease is the story of smallpox and Native Americans. It's a disease, smallpox experience among Native Americans has long been seen as another reference point in the devastation wrought by epidemics in the aftermath of settlement, colonization, and national expansion. And without going into detail in understanding the kind of depopulation of Native American populations, which coincides, of course, with Indian removal and a lot of other detrimental American practices. But in retrospect, there are historians today who see in COVID-19 echoes of this more shocking past. A direct result, they say, that the disparities we see in Native American settings, for instance, among the Navajo and Hopi reservations, is a direct result, and I might say a new chapter in a continuing story of oppressive policies and ongoing colonialism. Historians have also reflected on other forms of epidemic disease like typhus in the context of African American life, in which the stories of inequality are layered atop a long-standing story of African American social differences that are marked by a period of slavery and enslavement, decades of Jim Crow segregation, distinctive demographic movements from rural to urban contexts, and pervasive race-based inequalities in housing, work, and social life, which really determine and shape the epidemic experience. So, for instance, you have scholars who comment on the fact that typhus epidemics in the plantation South were more devastating in the Negro quarters, such that they were actually called Negro quarter fever. or others who reflect on cholera being particularly devastating to Blacks in the Caribbean in the 1830s, and noting that the disease inflicted on Blacks by the mortality inflicted by Blacks by cholera must be found in their environment of the period, the movement of the disease through major port cities, with Blacks inevitably predominating on the waterfronts, in the waterfront areas and of cities, as well as nearby plantations. They were more likely than whites to be in cholera's path because they were food handlers, they were stevedores. And in addition to that, the only water field hands had access to was that contained in stagnant pools vulnerable to contamination. So another thing that's produced in the wake of epidemics, another form of inequality, one might say, is the inequalities associated with biological speculation. That is, in explaining these differences, pandemics often reproduce all kinds of, you might say, epistemological inequalities. When people look at these differences and they say, what shall we make of them? There is inevitably this turn towards speculation about differences across the population. And this is not confined to American society. So Richard Evans, in his really excellent book called Death in Hamburg, which is about cholera in 19th century Europe, said that the middle class, the bourgeoisie, were often thought of themselves as immune from the disorder. And in a manner of speaking, they were right, because they correctly ascribed their immunity to the fact that they took all the necessary precautions and initiating a regime of surpassing cleanliness and self-discipline during the epidemic. And they had the means for actually preventing or protecting themselves. The well-off were able to take such elaborate precautions largely because they possessed the inestimable advantage of having servants in the household. I want to sort of just close by making a couple of comments about the fact that epidemics produce all manner of social controversy and turmoil. And it's been particularly interesting and shocking for me to see the debate around masks that has unfolded in the context of our current debate, the politicization of masks. It's a distant echo of what you could find during the influenza pandemic, in which these debates about personal liberty and the proper reach of public health was very, very much in the news then, as it is now. I'll close by making a couple of comments about the other kinds of, you might say, tensions and social inequalities that come into view that are echoes of our own time from the past. Alan Kraut, in his book Silent Travelers, Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace, has pointed out that there is often a kind of double helix of health and fear that is mobilized in the course of pandemics. And he points to the role of disease and epidemic in medicalization of pre-existing nativist prejudices. This we see in our time. Nayant Shah, in his 2001 Contagious Divides, expanded on this argument and the discussion of race and pandemics, smallpox, plague, tuberculosis, with reference, in his case, to Asian Americans in the West, tracing how, quote, the collection and interpretation of knowledge about the incidence of epidemic disease, mortality, and morbidity produced an ethnography of different groups, locations in the city, and also led and fostered an idea of Chinese deviance and danger. And then finally, I'll point to the work of Samuel Kelton Roberts in his study on tuberculosis and public health in Baltimore, who pointed out that that there's a way in which the segregation of Blacks in Baltimore not just fed these stereotypes, but actually fed the virulence of the disease. That is to say, an area of the city with a great deal of wastewater, which fed the kind of virulent transmission of tuberculosis. I want to end with a really fascinating and disturbing image pulled from the Atlanta newspapers in 1910. This actually appears in our colleagues Tara Hunter's book, To Joy My Freedom, and I reproduce it in an article that's coming out on kind of race and pandemics. And one of the things this shows is the kind of recurring themes of blame and accusation that are sometimes catalyzed in the wake of epidemics. And to kind of segue into the topic of housing to come next, the politics of epidemics and housing. What this graphic illustration shows is the white fear that emerges in the context of tuberculosis epidemics. It pictures a domestic servant, a Black washerwoman, who works in the average white home and who is pictured here flying with the vermin from her house, which flies the flag of contagious disease, past the trenches of filth and surpassing, leaping over the protections that are created by the average white home, the sanitary precautions, the screens, the pure water, the garbage cans, and all of the medical science that really stands to protect the modern average white family. What I want to highlight is that these are illustrations of the forms of inequality that become visible in the course of pandemics and epidemics and just endemic disease, but also they open deeper lines of social analysis and critique, and they open up the possibility of repair as well. So I want to put these illustrations of the past out there for us to consider whether, and to ask the question, what direction are we heading in with COVID-19? Is COVID-19 a moment of hopeful transformation, if not revolution, or economic transformation of different kinds? Is it a moment when, like we did in 2003, we kind of discovered poverty in the wake of, discovered poverty in the wake of Katrina, only to forget it shortly thereafter? Or is this story that we're living through now the basis of a deeper and more lasting transformation in the way we grapple with social inequality?
Thank you, Keith. Faulkner did say, sometimes the past isn't dead, sometimes it's not even past. Sometimes the past can be forgotten. And we have to remember that epidemic diseases, infectious diseases, were an integral part of urban life until around 1900. Things changed with the germ theory and public health measures. And epidemics were regular parts of the urban experience. And our last experience was really 1918. And we've forgotten a lot about that, and this is a strong reminder. So with that, we'll turn to the next speaker, Marta Tienda from Princeton.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to share my screen and start my time clock. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and for Patricia and Sanju and Doug for catching these ideas that we can all learn even as the pandemic unfolds. In the short time I have, I've studied a lot of literature on the K through 12 system. Most of my work up to date has been on higher education, but I really thought it was important to focus on the inputs because that's going to affect the outputs for higher education. So what I want to do is talk to 4 points. One of them is the pre-pandemic conditions. And I'll give a panorama of the current state of knowledge with a focus on race and ethnic and income differences, which is something of concern and interest to the organizers of the series, and highlight some of the fissures that have been already indicated by the prior speakers, and present some early evidence. These are snapshots, and I want to indicate that the process and our knowledge is very much in process. It's very incomplete. But there are certain themes that are emerging, and those are the ones I want to highlight. There is a lot of selection in the assessment of learning loss, because the most vulnerable are often excluded from the studies, and very few of the current studies or the assessments generating the evidence of how much learning has been lost through the school closures actually consider duration of exposure to remote, to hybrid, and to in-class. So with all those caveats, I will try to highlight what is currently known, sometimes up to this through this early spring. And then I want to indicate some perils on the horizon. There's been a lot lot of focus on schools and teachers, but mainly by why they're not coming into the classroom. And I want to highlight some structural underpinnings of the process of transformation of the teacher workforce that have been underway since the last recession, and hope to conclude with some implications that draw lessons from the Great Recession, where K through 12 education and higher education, public education more generally, was impacted. So I want to start with the initial conditions, and I call this the perfect storm. Why? Because we have this decentralized public education system, which is unlike many of our industrialized peers that are where public education is centrally located, controlled, funded. And so we had like 13,000 school districts, and many of which were making different decisions at different times about when to close, how to close, what kind of resources they have. There are already, in addition, large resource disparities across these states and districts, so that the ability that they had to respond was quite uneven from the beginning, and it only accentuated with the COVID crisis. And then these looming teacher shortages. So these are three preconditions that when you add the pandemic response, we have a giant natural experiment. Oh, I forgot to start my watch. First of all, there were these closures, pivots to remote instruction with varied duration and starting times. There was very uneven district timing, preparedness, and ability to respond and how they responded, and highly unequal digital access and proficiencies among the teaching staff as well as the student population. So there were these scrambles to provide devices and Wi-Fi. What this resulted is in this patchwork of learning modes across districts that changed from spring to fall as they had a little bit more time to regroup. But this is just a quick illustration of the kinds of strategies that were, I call it the district scramble for remote learning. States were recommending that we do this, that, and the other. The districts are doing the best they can with the resources they do and do not have. So we have very, very mixed heterogeneous responses. And this results in even more inequities. So in fall of 2020, this fall, there was already some assessment of what happened in the spring, those last 3 months of the academic year. In early fall, fully 60% of the school age K through 12 population was fully remote, but there were these large differences by race and ethnicity. Even at the beginning of this month, almost 1 year after the pandemic declared, half of public school students were still, only half were receiving in-person instruction full-time. There are some that are receiving it part-time, like students at Princeton. In Princeton, you go 2 days a week, and other groups go other 2 days, et cetera. But what's important from this slide is not only how many are hybrid or how many are fully remote, but also in the fall to see these large disparities by race and ethnicity, where you see a 20-point gap approximately between the share of Black and Hispanic students who are fully remote and white students who are fully remote. This is consequential because there is mounting evidence that the remote learning was not as good as the in-teacher instruction, which I don't think anybody would challenge. But just for some color to this perspective, it's measuring the quality of remote instruction is harder. It's kind of a loosey-goosey exercise. But this rough approximation is based on data from this iReady instruction and assessment software. Admittedly, it covers only certain student populations, but it's instructive. So as of spring in 2020, from March to May, 40% of low-income students were totally disengaged. They couldn't find them. They were like non-enrolled. They weren't logging into whatever. They had no access, most likely because of no devices or Wi-Fi. That's pretty substantial. And that 40% of the African-American and 30% of the Hispanic student population also did not have any instruction, any connection to the school system. So they became totally disengaged during this period, whereas for white students, it was considerably less. They have the highest share with average or above average quality remote instruction. So you can see that even though these are approximations based on certain diagnostic tools that are available to try to track what's happening in the school system, the inequities that were already there are being exposed in the learning modes. And this slide just simply reinforces this because it's already in the fall of 2020, there has been some improvement, which is a good thing in access, but there are persisting gaps by race. Twice the share of Blacks and Hispanics had no access to teachers compared to the share of white students. So again, these racial and ethnic disparities are playing out through the technological divide. So here comes what do we know? What have we learned? The fall report cards. I learned at the University of Chicago that you want to get your conclusions up front. So there are two generalizations that should be unsurprising, but it's important to state them, that there's more loss in math than in reading, with systematic disparities by grade, by demographic group, and by income level, and I'll try to illustrate that. And that there's more loss in schools that are dominated by minority students than schools dominated by white. Again, this is just another take on the consequences by race and ethnicity, and how the pandemic is playing out to widen the fissures that were already in place, as Keith has and Sanyu have pointed out. So the averages I'll show you conceal extensive heterogeneity across these 13,000 districts, and even the assessment tools that are used, as well as whether the assessments were done in the spring, and whether some schools didn't want to conduct assessments because they didn't want to be using them for accountability, as opposed to try to understand how much catch-up is needed. So I would also caution that the estimates are likely to be conservative because of selection and exclusion of some of the most disadvantaged students. But to begin, this is based on a national, the pandemic is global, so it's not only US. And it's interesting to focus on what a teacher survey revealed about learning losses among other industrialized peers. And about 2 months of learning loss on average. That includes math and literacy and arts, et cetera. And the US is kind of on the upper end. The UK has the highest, 2.8 months on average. In the US, teachers reported that on average, and in the fall, based on what was after the spring shutdown, students were on average 2.5 months behind where they would have been normally at the beginning of fall. But learning loss has, in the fall data, there was some assessment of where students were. And this is the foundation for the claims about the differences in math learning loss and language art learning loss. So in math, the learning loss was approximately 3 months, but you can see that it was higher in the grades 5 and 6, and then even more weeks in grades 7 and 8. This stands to reason because math is a cumulative discipline, and students that are missing certain parts in the following year are going to be even worse off. In reading, it's about 1.5 months, but there's some disagreement about. There was a recent article in the New York Times. I've been trying to keep up with this literature, and it's pretty hard, saying that it's actually more in reading, but that was based on some oral reading skills that was being recorded. But again, there's huge selection bias in those studies, because English language learners, how are they going to be accommodated or taught when the teacher's wearing a mask? So there are all these challenges that make the data quite imperfect, but very systematic findings along racial, ethnic, and economic lines. So the reading losses, it's important for those young students who were in first grade. That's kind of hard for them because that's when they're learning to read. Second and third grade, they're reading to learn. And so it's possible to be ahead of expectation in grade 2 because the foundations were laid. But this is very preliminary evidence. And you can trust Raj Chetty and his group to be up to speed on some of the consequences of learning loss. And they've looked more carefully at math. And they're using an online platform. It's called Zern. And it's a platform that's used by many schools as a supplement or part of a school curriculum. And they have about 800,000 students that they're using for this assessment. Clearly, schools that don't have the digital resources are not even going to be included here. But of those schools that are using Zern, and there are quite a few students that are benefited or were participating, you can see these very large differences that begin to plummet. The amount of homework completed plummets in March, which is when the schools began to close after the pandemic was announced, and then they widened substantially and stay wide over the period through the end of the fall. So disengagement rises in mid-March, especially for the low-income students, reflecting probably their limited access at that time. By fall, there's a bit more responsiveness to providing resources. This is a different comparison, but a very important comparison because the data is quite imprecise in some of the measurement assessments. So this comparison is conservative. It deals with, it represents 25 states that actually conducted in-school assessments. So it's leaving out those that did not or that conducted them remotely, but at least we have a systematic comparison. And what it's doing is actually comparing them to what it would be the historical performance of students on the conventional assessment. So you have at least some benchmark to compare schools and more apples to apples comparison than what we've been seeing at many of the other studies. So they also concur that the loss was much greater in math than in reading. So that seems to be quite a robust finding. How much is still to be determined. And it's more loss in the higher grades. And you can see this by the location, the percentages relative to historical average of where the students were testing at the beginning of the fall. The loss is also importantly greater at the schools where minorities comprise over half of the student population. So again, the combination of the timing of the grades and the location and the benchmark comparisons, I think, are really powerful, real powerful evidence. So this is on the outputs based on the closures of schools and the heterogeneity that is concealed by all these average comparisons in the US. But there are these other perils on the horizon, and this I found quite worrisome, and these are the teacher shortages and funding squeeze. And I have focused on funding squeezes in the past, particularly with higher education and also K through 12 by districts on average, but not with focus on the teaching force. Teachers are so critical for the most critical input for learning. That's the piece that COVID sort of dismantled or diminished by having it go remote or no access whatsoever. And they're critical then to retain. But there was a big lesson in the recession. And this had to do with what happened to public funding after the recession of 2008, 2009. And this slide shows the K through 12 workforce in millions in the United States at the time of the recession and the housing crisis, and then how it fell precipitously, reaching its low point in 2010 and was gradually recovering. It's still 40,000 below in 2019 when we began the year of that the COVID hit. So the lesson, the takeaway here is that the teaching workforce took a big hit and has not been fully restored, and the cuts proved lasting. Differ, of course, across states. Some states were barely recovering. Some states were fully recovered. But in fact, there were even greater losses in public education in some of those support systems that make it possible for students to succeed in school. Social workers, nurses, counselors that direct to higher education. And the pre-fall pandemic, local public education jobs, teachers, and others were 60,000 below the 2008 level. So this is including the broader, it's more than just the teaching workforce. And it's 300,000 below what would be required to keep up with enrollment, which is what the top dotted line shows. So if they had just been level, it would have been, that's 60,000, the light green dotted line, and the dark blue dotted line is what is required to be keeping up with enrollment during this period. But equally demoralizing is the fact that teacher plans to leave the classroom. There's evidence that more teachers have become demoralized. And this is based on a national survey of educators, and 20% said they were somewhat likely to leave the profession compared to 10% pre-pandemic. So it has taken a toll, and leaving aside whether or not the unions are behind, you got to go back or you don't have to go back. And behind it, there's a compounding this crisis of teacher access is a substitute shortage. In some places, it's really at critical proportions. This is a billboard. Michigan, the state of Michigan put up billboards all over the state trying to recruit substitute teachers because there's such a shortfall. And several states have begun to lower the standards to get substitute teachers, which by one estimate, over the course of a 12-year K through 12 learning career, students have about 2/3 of a year with substitutes. Going forward, there are some lessons from the Great Recession. We saw this movie before with the huge budget cuts where we're using students as a balance wheel for budget shortfalls. And it's unlikely that the budget relief pass that President Biden is going to sign today is going to make the necessary funds to make up the losses that have been compounded this spring. So the consequences are going to be quite formidable. It depends on school funding. The schools that rely on property taxes are going to have fared better, but they're the ones that have the greatest inequity because they're based on property taxes. And those that have state funds have been have faced huge pure pupil funding losses. So why money matters, there's growing evidence that this funding shortfall is going to further aggravate the achievement crisis, both through the teaching workforce, resource workforce, et cetera. And I'll stop here because I'm almost at 15 minutes and we can do the rest with questions and answers. Thank you. Stop. Doug, you're muted.
As we can see in a normal school year, schools and students are underfunded if they're from minority groups and from low-income families. And one of the most important determinants of what happens in schools is the degree of school segregation. And school segregation, of course, comes from housing segregation. So that's my segue to Matt Desmond, whose main field of study is housing.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Sanyu, for this opportunity. And it's always an honor to be with my esteemed colleagues. So the United States is unique in the fact that the public housing crisis and the public health crisis were exacerbated at the same time. There's no other peer nation that is reeling from a housing crisis brought on by COVID the extent to which we are today. And to kind of walk us through and kind of set the stage of where we were before the pandemic hit was, incomes have been very flat for many Americans over the last several decades, but housing costs have soared. The median rent has basically doubled over the last 2 decades, while incomes have been flat. So there's this shrinking gap between what many American families are bringing in and what they have to pay for basic shelter needs. And then there's the plain fact that the federal government really hasn't stepped up to fill that gap. Only about 1 in 4 families who qualify for any kind of housing assistance, be that housing vouchers or public housing, only about 1 in 4 of those families receive any help from the federal government. But the unlucky majority, the remaining 75%, receive nothing. And the waiting list for public housing for some of our biggest cities is no longer counted in years, it's counted in decades. And so the last time LA, for example, opened up its Section 8 voucher housing list was in 2018, and it had been 13 years since they opened up that list. So those 3 ingredients, flat incomes, rising housing costs, and a government that doesn't invest in housing, has created a housing crisis. So this is a graph that shows the percentage of renting families below the poverty line, spending 30% of their income or less on housing, that's that blue line, or 50% or more of their income on housing costs, which is that green line. And the share of poor renting families spending most of their money on rent and utilities has increased over the years to the point that today, the majority of poor renting families spend at least half of their income on housing costs. And about 1 in 4 of those families are spending about 70% or more of their income just on rent and utilities. And under that situation, eviction is something that isn't the result of personal irresponsibility as much as the result of inevitability. So I have the privilege of directing the eviction lab here at Princeton. We cultivate a database of about 100 million eviction records from every state in the country. Many of the findings I'm going to show you that follow is a collaboration and is a result of the hard work of my team at the lab. So every year in America, about 3.7 million evictions are filed around the United States. That's about 7 evictions a minute. That number is far higher than the number of foreclosure starts, even at the height of the foreclosure crisis. Incredible amount of instability every single year for renters. This is before the pandemic. This matters because eviction causes loss. Families lose their homes, of course, and they're often plunged into homelessness, but they often also lose their neighborhoods, their social connections. As Marta would be concerned with, the kids lose their school and are shuffled from one school to another. Families often lose their stuff, their possessions, which are taken by movers or piled on the street to be kind of scavenged. It takes a good amount of time and money to build a home. An eviction can just erase all that. An eviction comes with a mark, a criminal or a civic court record, I should say. And that mark can prevent you from moving into a decent neighborhood and prevent you from moving into stable housing, good housing, because many property owners see that mark and they say no, which is why studies show that families, after they get evicted, move into worse housing in neighborhoods with higher levels of crime and poverty than they lived in before. Eviction has been linked to health consequences like suicide, adverse birth outcomes, depression. And I think when you add all that up, the conclusion is eviction isn't just a condition of poverty, it's a cause of poverty. It's making things worse. This is a problem that's not only New York's problem or San Francisco's problem. This is a problem that's affecting communities all across the country. In fact, the highest evicting cities are cities with pretty average housing costs, places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Richmond, Virginia, Albuquerque, New Mexico. We usually don't talk about places like Albuquerque or Wilmington, Delaware, when it comes to talking about the American housing crisis, but we absolutely should. These are the cities that are experiencing the highest rates of eviction. And this also isn't just an urban problem. Suburban and even small cities and towns across the country experience high rates of displacement. So if you look at this map, this is Ohio and Pennsylvania. The purple here is just population, and the red dots signify the eviction rate. Bigger the dot, bigger the rate. So it is true that evictions are concentrated in cities like Cleveland or Akron or Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. But what's pretty striking to me about this map is that there's fairly high eviction rates in suburban and rural communities across the country as well. And I think that should signal to us that when we talk about the American housing crisis and eviction, we're not just talking about a coastal issue, an urban issue. We are talking about a national problem. But to the theme of this panel, this is not a problem that affects people randomly or affects different racial groups equally. This is a problem that's really been born by African American and Latino communities. The first reason for this is quite simply, when we think of America as a nation of homeowners, that's really it's really a nation of white homeowners. So the majority of white families today own their homes, but the majority of Black and Latino families in America do not own their homes. They're renters, and they're disproportionately exposed to fluctuations in the rental market and the eviction crisis. One way to read, for example, the history of African Americans is a history of being systematically dispossessed from the soil, the land that is the United States, from slavery to sharecropping, the Great Migration and the ghettoization of African Americans in cities like Milwaukee and Chicago. This kind of follows through to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which only happened because Martin Luther King was murdered on a Memphis balcony and led to the fall of legal segregation, but that didn't stop de facto segregation, as Doug Massey's work has clearly shown. And that leads us all the way up to the subprime crisis, which, and here Doug's work comes in again, we know that Black and Latino communities were specifically targeted by predatory factors. And that's led to this semi-permanent creation of a permanent renter class of Black and Latino families in America. Those families are also disproportionately burdened by the high cost of housing. So this is data from the Joint Housing Center at Harvard. And the kind of darker orange here is the percent of households that are severely rent burdened. These are households paying 50% or more of their income on housing costs, and the lighter orange is the moderate rent burden, paying at least 30%, between 30 to 50% of your income on housing costs. And you'll see, according to their data, the majority of African American and Hispanic homes are either moderately or severely rent burdened in the United States. When you look at evictions, you're also met with the realization that they have a racial component as well. You look at eviction filing rates. This is kind of the rate of renters in America threatened with displacement. It's about 1 in 20 for all US renters in an average year, but for Black renters, that ratio is 1 in 11. If you look at the eviction rate, which is kind of the rate of eviction judgments, like when a judge says, hey, family, you got to get out of your home, the rate of judgments to renter homes, that's a rate of about 1 in 40 for US renters, but for Black renters, that's a rate of 1 in 25. And in fact, if you map evictions across the country, the concentration and the hot spots where evictions highest is throughout the Southeast and then up the Mississippi. These are communities with extremely high concentrations of low-income African-American homes. So what are we learning in COVID about these patterns? Well, one thing that we're learning is these patterns are being reproduced and accelerated during the crisis. So we can't collect every single eviction that's happening in COVID, but we're doing that on a weekly basis now for several states and dozens of cities across the country, as much as we can. And what we're learning is that Black and Latino renters are overrepresented among the families that are being threatened with eviction even during the pandemic. So for example, if you look at this chart, the percentage of Blacks represented in our data, Black renters are about 20% of our data, but they're about 35% of homes threatened with eviction. And that disparity is also replicated, though to a lesser degree, within Latino homes. For whites, it's the opposite. They're kind of underrepresented with respect to being threatened with eviction, respective to their rental composition in America. Now, the federal government has taken massive historic steps to prevent eviction during the pandemic. You know, when the pandemic started, housing organizers around the country started talking about an eviction moratorium, and people laughed at them and said it was impossible. And then pretty soon New York State had an eviction moratorium, and then pretty soon North Dakota had an eviction moratorium, and then we had a federal eviction moratorium under the Trump administration. Has that been effective? We believe it has. We believe it has been incredibly effective. By our estimate, the eviction moratoria, the local, state, and the federal moratoria have prevented over 1 million evictions that probably would have happened in the absence of these kind of stoppages. So the bottom line kind of shows the cumulative buildup of evictions in a normal year based on historical data. And you can see in March, when the moratoria started taking into effect, those lines just diverging and a massive number of evictions stopped. But states have interpreted the moratoria very differently. Some states have stopped the very beginning of the eviction process, the eviction filing. Some states have stopped only at the very end of the process, the sheriff coming and throwing you out. So the number of evictions have been prevented really depend on like how strong the moratoria are. And it's not really complicated. If you stop all of the eviction process from filing to courtroom to the sheriff coming, that's a much more tighter protection for tenants. It's important because local studies show that about a third of tenants who receive an eviction notice leave before even going to court. They either interpret that notice as an eviction order itself, or they know the gig is up and they leave before going to court. The bad news is that the moratorium don't do anything about building rental arrears that is happening during the pandemic, and the arrears are rising at a very quick pace. So in New York City, for example, an average eviction case was about for $2,500 before the pandemic. Now it's about for $5,000. In Houston, you see a similar kind of trend, about $1,000 a landlord was claiming before the pandemic. Now it's about double that. So we're seeing renters fall deeper and deeper into a hole. These are the same renters, by the way, that have always been threatened with eviction. It's not that eviction is spreading, to new communities or people paying higher rents. It's that folks that are vulnerable before the pandemic are becoming much more vulnerable throughout the pandemic. I just want to close with 4 quick policy implications. A national moratorium on evictions exists, but it's incredibly threatened. It's being threatened with lawsuits all around the country. Renters have to wait every month to kind of see if they get to stay or go based on this. But this is something that saves lives. A new NBER study showed that the eviction moratorium probably decreased deaths in America during the pandemic by 11%. So if we care about Black lives, Latino lives, we have to care about protecting folks from exposure and doubling up in homelessness until we get COVID under control. Rent relief is also critical. Eviction is violent and harmful in all cases. And so we need a deeper investment in making sure families get to stay in their homes after these moratoria lift. They won't be around forever. The federal government has dedicated about $25 billion to rent relief, but the dedication has been odd. It's based on population, not renter population. And so if you divvy that allocation up by renter units, it means that if you're a renter in California, that rent relief will basically be about $440 per renter household. But if you're a renter in like New Hampshire, that's about $1,300 per renter household. So the way that the government has designed rent relief is designed in a way to privilege majority white, majority rural states at the expense of states with much larger renter populations and much more diverse renter populations. We should change that. Third, these data are something that we collected, but this is an important issue that should be in the purview of the federal government's budget. The federal government doesn't even collect evictions on public housing, like housing it owns. It doesn't even know how many evictions it executes. So we're really designing policy in the dark. That should change going forward. And we should use this crisis to invest deeper in housing. The good news is things like public housing and Section 8 vouchers have massive returns on fighting poverty and enhancing social mobility. The bad news is not enough people get the benefit they desperately need. And without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. So thanks y'all for listening, and really looking forward to Jeff, to your comments.
Okay, with that, we turn to our interlocutor, Jeff Ward, who has a good historical perspective on things for his own opinions and for some reactions to what he's heard so far.
Thank you, Doug, for the introduction, and to everyone for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation. My work is really centered on currently on the haunting legacies of historical racial violence. And I've been interested as a sociologist for a long time in the temporal and spatial arcs of racialized violence. And I'm going to say a few things related to that in my time today. Just so that in case people are not aware, we know from a pretty large body of work now that histories of slavery, lynching, and other racialized violence consistently predict spatial distributions of racialized conflict and violence and inequality today. And the story here is seemingly that our society embodies and reproduces structures of inequality that are rooted in histories of violence. This violence is cultural informed, structural informed, corporeal or bodily informed, shapes and maintains structures of inequality through a number of mechanisms of extraction, of displacement, and so on, resulting in zones and other distributions or distillations of opportunity on the one hand, and zones, distributions of abandonment or precarity on the other. And I was thinking, as Matthew, as you were talking about how all the long history of racist pogroms in US history that have displaced Black populations are bound up with the housing insecurity still today, in part because of the inability over generations to establish wealth, which is largely through, in this country, through our housing markets. So pandemics reveal and exacerbate the stratification that is centuries in the making, that is intergenerational and multidimensional. And I want to just say a few more things about the interactive part of this point, that they not only reveal, but that they exacerbate. I'm interested in this interaction. Some of the ways pandemics and our responses to them, whether discursively or through policy or through, weaponization and otherwise, are not unfolding alongside this historical and sociological story, but become bound up with them. And so that's what I really want to focus on. And one example of that is that I was particularly interested to me is how public health crises seem to relate to societal convulsions. And this is completely speculative. I'm curious about this and wanting to learn more about it. But it's intriguing to me that the influenza pandemic of 1918 coincides so closely with the Red Summer of 1919, this explosion of a white racist resentment that results in violence in numerous American cities, again, this displacement and so many other things. And COVID corresponds, interestingly, with not only resurgent white nationalism, but distinctly, I think, a profound reckoning with white supremacy. This may be a kind of sociological mirage, but I think these convulsions or inflection moments have something to do with these unique surges in things like precarity in jobs and housing and career prospects, and surges in perceptions of threat, and also the kind of thing that Emil Durkheim called normlessness, anomie, and others have written about as anomie, this sort of moments of normlessness where new possibilities open up, or the appearance of them at least open up. I do find some hope in this moment in the growing interpersonal and institutional commitment, it seems, to dismantling white supremacy and the structures of inequality that have stemmed from it. But there are, of course, these profound challenges. And one of them, again, an example, I think, of the interaction is the problem of indifference to suffering and death that we are so practiced in, that traces to eugenic thinking, for example, but also it results in medical, there's a history here that has caused a kind of pattern of medical and health estrangement that we are challenged to grapple with. In a conversation this morning with Walter Johnson, who I'm co-teaching with this semester, we were talking about the Centerville sewage crisis in Illinois. And he said, we're talking about the challenges that the community mobilizing around that is facing. And he said, the biggest one is the quote, enormous inertial weight of indifference, where we become used to living with the suffering of Black and otherwise non-white people as a kind of societal background. And we see this, I think, in the ways that we are able to kind of live with the devastating toll of the pandemic, particularly for certain subpopulations. And eugenic thinking per se is not required anymore. It's kind of like, Charles Tilly wrote about, the sociologist, durable inequality doesn't require the thoughtful, intentional discrimination. It is so deeply in our fabric now to this idea that these people are destined to premature death one way or another. We see that in the aftermath of police killings. We see it also in the context of the pandemic. Another piece here I want to attend to is this idea of violence as a kind of spectacle, and the problem and the issue of unspectacular violence as the challenge of mobilizing opposition is concerned. I'm going to refer here to Rob Nixon in a moment, but it's just generally, I think, interesting and instructive to contrast the outrage of racist police violence, the outrage that racist police violence creates, with reactions to lethal inaction in the case of the pandemic. The withholding of protection, whether on the part of police or policymakers or others, does not mobilize the same intensity of opposition, even though its toll in terms of population health and well-being is magnitudes greater. The withholding of protection as a problem of violence is difficult to capture. Rob Nixon, who's an environmentalist, writes about this in his book, Slow Violence, which the term he uses to describe a violence occurring gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction, dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. And the reason he's focusing on violence is because of its potential to mobilize concern, care, and opposition. And he says, that it poses, slow violence poses distinct scientific, legal, political, and representational challenges. So, for example, how do we register disregard for mask mandates as a problem of violence, as a form of violence? And how do we measure that toll? It's very difficult to measure the toll of the disregard for mask mandates. We know it's there. We know it's likely harmful to us, but it's difficult to register it from a measurement perspective as well. I think the pandemic allows us to see some of this more clearly, and really to behold structural racism in the health context and otherwise, and how it is intertwined with so many other issues like housing and labor markets and in the environment. Here in St. Louis, a lot of the discussion about pre-existing conditions necessarily brought up environmental racism and exposure to unhealthy air to tell those stories. And so I'm somewhat encouraged here because I think this ability to see this problem as violence will inform, in its complexity, will inform more transformative policy and other responses. Of course, we can also expect that the nation will at some point, and particularly the dominant groups in this country, will look away at some point. Again, kind of lowering the what a St. Louis journalist described in the wake of a lynching in 1836, described as the veil of oblivion. And in that case, he said, this is so horrible, we should just lower the veil of oblivion, like we do, and move on. And we've seen this over and over again. It has routinely been the case. Oftentimes, as in the case of masks, oftentimes in the name of white freedom, that we should look away. We can look away because the freedom of the white population requires it. So let me close with a last word about this thing I'm going to call ungovernable whiteness, and as a problem bound that the pandemic not only reveals but exacerbates in a sense, and I'm interested here in particular in the notion of white, though not exclusively, white male standing and authority, which is a kind of proprietary orientation and a profound obstacle to public health policy and practice and so many other realms, I think, of policy change. It is this ungovernable disposition is literally killing us, and it has been since race was invented. And we've been devising all these workarounds to lessen the toll, and there are other things as well. I don't mean to reduce our problems of our world to this phenomenon, but it is profound, very simply because white supremacy is a world system. And again, when we can look beyond COVID to understand that context crisis in an interactive way. For example, to thinking about what political scientist Tara Daggett recently called petromasculinity, describing how conspicuous consumption of fossil fuels has become bound up with white masculinity and what she calls authoritarian desire. And the same kind of authoritarian desire, I would argue, is bound up with the refusal to wear masks, the determination to demonstrate your freedom to disregard the well-being of others. And I realize that this is not the white men don't have a monopoly on this practice, but I would argue anecdotally at least, that there is some correlation there. So finally, this ungovernable sort of point can lead also to, and the petromasculinity point can lead, is related directly to COVID-related and often racialized violence. And I'm thinking about, scapegoated Asian Americans, for example, who in this country have been subject to racist violence by people of various backgrounds, but in this kind of violent response to the pandemic itself, and also violence against those seeking to enforce mask mandates. I was just reading about an Uber driver, I think, or one of the who was attacked by a passenger who refused to wear a mask after being asked several times to do so. So, so these are again examples of more typical violence, things we think of more typically as racialized violence. But I want to close again with the reminder, the emphasis on the point that that this refusal to recognize the interests of others and to protect them is mostly a problem of slow or unspectacular violence that is largely enacted through continued viral spread. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to remind everyone that we are still quite a racially segregated society, and class segregation is rising, Black segregation is persisting, and Latino isolations within neighborhoods is also rising. And the insidious thing about segregation is that it allows white people to live in a world where they don't see white privilege, and it inflicts all the pain and damage on the people that are segregated and separated away. So let's give each of the participants about a 5-minute period to reflect on what they've heard today with their own message and respond to the message of others. So we'll begin with Keith.
Great. Well, what a terrific panel. And it's hard to know where to start with my comments. I'll start with, maybe I'll just float a couple of questions and some observations. When Marta was discussing the learning loss, I was actually interested in the broader sort of spectrum of what is lost on math scores, and academic achievement is interesting, but it strikes me that there's another irony with what is being lost, in the sense that the pivot to online learning, obviously, as inferior as it is to in-person, also is a kind of a space for skills development for a lot of students. That is to say, they've pivoted to very young kids, computer initiated, savvy kind of, which I suspect will also have a kind of contribute to the digital divide, if you know what I mean. So it's the kind of double-edged nature of what is lost. That is to say, kids are losing access to math and less so reading, but the kids who are actually gaining online education are actually doing something of lasting significance in this digital space that will be really so central to future lives and learning and careers. In Matt's presentation, the one question that I had, which I think is so fascinating, is how, and this is something that I've been seeing myself in my own field, is how the pandemic has created a reframing of the kinds of issues that we worked on through the lens of health, or as Jeff put it, violence. And let me say what I mean. I was fascinated that it's the CDC that created the federal moratorium. And in a previous world, this would be unimaginable, that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention could be the arm of government to make the argument that we need a national eviction moratorium. And that, to me, is illustrative of one of the things we talk about for what happens in pandemics, which is that long-standing inequalities get reframed through the lens of public health. And government actually can move in. And that reframing is going to be lasting. Because once you've reframed housing as a public health reality, Yes, it's possible that that moratorium will end, et cetera. But the framing has been done. So I'm interested in that and a lot of other things. And then the last thing I'll say is I really like Jeff's comments specifically because of it's another kind of opportunity that's created. Let me just say that this reframing also happens in other areas of public policy, like in the critiques of the carceral state, where the history of incarceration and the disparities that are produced by differences in how we do drug surveillance became a public health problem. And as a result, you have movements to empty prisons in the name of public health, but really doing the work that reformers have been trying to do for years. So these are some opportunities to kind of think. And then finally, I want to share with you, in response to Jeff, I recently gave a talk called Whose Pain Matters. And you can see this in some ways is an interesting illustration of the divide that Jeff has been describing. That is the performance of anti-mask sentiment, figured here as male and white, which is also kind of saying that what masks are creating is a command to breathe one's own CO2. So you have this other myth of self-asphyxiation as juxtaposed. And so there's this fascinating kind of new discussion about whose breathing matters, whether it's George Floyd's or Eric Garner's, or in the case of this individual who is in some ways appropriating the language of I can't breathe to make their own claims about harms that are being done to them in the context of the pandemic. The last comment I'll make on this topic is that I think that these are, you might say, opportunities, and it is true that the public health frame is not just a kind of a medical frame. It's a frame that really raises broader questions about our existing social institutions, but also how we relate to each other and how we will kind of, anyway, I'll leave it at that. It's just a lot of fascinating observations. I could say a lot more, but I'll stop there.
Okay, Marta?
Thank you, Keith. That was really wonderful. And I think that the presentations collectively raise two big questions to me. One that I wrote about in the mid-90s. What are the tolerable limits of inequality? And I suggested at the time that the tolerable limits of inequality are rising. We went through this period, and that was the aberration, it turns out, the 60s and 70s, and then it started to pivot. So that's kind of the backdrop that I think frames many of the filters through which we are experiencing the current pandemic. And I would add today, the tolerable dimension, what are the dimensions of inequality that are framed through this threshold of what's tolerable? And the second question, issue that comes to the fore from these presentations that Keith just brought up into sharper relief, and that is the question of blame. So it was very salient in the what you were putting forth, Keith, and I think that the stage was set with the president calling the Chinese virus the kung flu, all that rhetoric has a very long tail, and we're starting to see it now in very dramatic ways across a broad spectrum of venues, not only in school. None of the data on school losses include the one that I reviewed, and I was trying to stick to some higher level studies, broke out by the Asian population, which I think is unfortunate. It's something to go back and think about. But Asians, that lingering, that innuendo and that direct causal language about the being imported from China was one thing. More recently, and I'm living in a state now, Texas, that is the big blame state now. We blamed everybody. The governor does not have enough fingers in his hands to blame people for the blackout. But in addition, To distract attention, he has decided to go to the border, blame immigrants, and he is now blaming the immigrants for bringing in COVID. So he has made a direct connection between the crisis on the border, the young people, and why we're having surging rates. That didn't stop him from ending mass. He said, if we didn't have the crisis on the border, if we didn't have all this immigration of COVID, we would have been able to open up sooner. I mean, just think about the kind of attribution that's made, but because it is made from a bully pulpit, it is made from a political position. So when we think about policy and politics, I still have, maybe I'm self-deluding about the importance of evidence-based policy. And I know we have several people in DC now that are actually interested in evidence for policy making. And I would hope that evidence about learning loss, evidence about the cost of the recession in the past will actually play a role in saying, let's not let this happen to us again, so that we have these lost generations. It's not just one generation, it's this gradual erosion, a slight recovery and further erosion across various cohorts. I sound like a demographer, but I can't help it. That is going to accumulate over time. The Federal Reserve has estimated the productivity losses. They're quite monumental. Who is listening? Who is listening? So that's a broader question. Your issue about the learning loss, that is just what the mastery of skills is a narrow definition. I totally agree. Khan, who started the Khan Academy, talks about from his perspective. He said, we can develop the technology for learning and teaching. They've gotten that down to a science. The question is engagement with the technology. And he said, that is the big challenge we're facing, which is why I tried to focus on also those that are totally disengaged, who are not connected, either through no fault of their own or because it simply does not motivate them. The structure of their day has been dismantled. And all of that comes to play out in learning loss. The question is, who's going to be blamed? Is it that they're not motivated? As we look down the line, say, well, why did they fall behind? They were given a Chromebook, or they were given that. That may be necessary. It's not sufficient. They may be sharing it with multiple people. That's not taken into account. Jake Roof, who you all know, has done this wonderful paper for an Annals volume I'm editing, and he has a very explicit consideration of COVID and how it has played out through the housing crisis, and how it is particularly detrimental for Latino and African American families, where he's making connections with the types of jobs that they have. And I think that an additional connection with Matt's, as people, even if they don't lose their house and they're moving to different houses, there's learning disruption taking place in addition, that is being compounded by this lack of access to the resources. So the structures that generated the inequality were already in place. They have been exacerbated, and the dimensions have been magnified in ways that I think are really problematic. So I'm not going to give up on trying to fight the good fight, but I think we're swimming. We need to keep in mind the policy and politics that I'm reminded of every day because I live in Texas.
Matt?
Wow, so much on the table here. Keith, was just, there was so much there in those 15 minutes. I couldn't help but thinking of these links between, housing and health, which you brought up. I remember, reading in Joe Trotter's book on Milwaukee, the link between tuberculosis and ghettoization, and it's there throughout all epics and this one. And I really, I'm resonating deeply with your call for reframing. And one of the resonances is, part of our job as academics is to pitch in with that. I feel you can see this in the minimum wage debates, right? Where we have a shift from all these concerns about labor market effects to more health economists now getting involved and asking, does raising the minimum wage save lives? And it turns out it does. People smoke less, people sleep more. And so I think that this, thinking about these reframes and how we contribute to that is so important. I remember talking to a housing activist for a magazine piece I wrote during the pandemic. And, he said, we don't want to go back to normal. Normal was broken in the first place. And, to Doug's opening remarks, the crisis can reveal these fissures, but can also reveal these other opportunities. Marta, it was like a dissertation's worth of information crammed into 15 minutes. So incredible. And I wondered, I couldn't help but thinking of what the long-term effects of the teachers' unions will be. And thinking about how the unions have found themselves in this incredibly vulnerable and controversial position, and what we think the long-term effects of that might be on their reputation. I also wondered along Jeff's lines too, what are we missing? It seems, some of the houses that I've been in, and I know you've been in as well during your research, they're just completely antithetical to studying, to quiet. And if a kid is trapped in a house like that for a year, what are the things that a survey just is really hard to grasp on things like mental health, for example. Jeff gave us this incredibly ambitious and challenging concept about ungovernable whiteness. What a phrase, what a concept. And it raised two ideas in my head. One is how that connects with the Republican Party, or what the Republican Party has become. And I'm thinking of Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker's work on plutocratic populism, right? The idea of the conservative dilemma of splitting the voting base between kind of the traditional business elites and kind of the cultural base. And I think that connects to the ungovernable whiteness idea and the political aspects, often to the detriment of those white folks. And so this is like the book Dying of Whiteness, for example, by Jonathan Metzl. You vote against Medicare expansion and that comes back to bite you. So I feel, Jeff, that's this incredible challenge you presented to us, and I'd wonder what our way out of that is. Well, what are our steps out of that to be? So thank you all.
Jeff, some thoughts?
Well, it's so rich. I mean, it's amazing how much can be brought to bear in these short periods, short stretches. The thing foremost in my mind right now is Keith's response to Marta about the flip side of the learning loss and gain, and it's again the accumulation disaccumulation story that is in all of these structural contexts, right? Often accumulation through disaccumulation. But what I'm thinking about is how my third grade son sent me his first email this morning, and it was like, and what it was probably a Google generated message that said, he had shared a document with me, right, that he's working on, aptly titled "Racism is Unfair." And I'd made some comments in it, mostly to just, play with him yesterday and fix some spelling things. And he wrote me this email this morning that said, "I was so happy to see you in my document." And it really touched me. It's so deeply moving, but it is exactly I think to the point Keith is making. His confidence, his ability to navigate that space, although it may come at the detriment of other kinds of things, is being bolstered by virtue of us choosing to live in a community, a suburb of St. Louis called Clayton, where there are really strong public schools. And I think also about this. I've thought about this a lot. I think we all do, working in universities. I used to teach in the University of California system, and you would get a much wider spread of students from different feeding schools, public and private. And the profound challenge as trying to reconcile the inequality related to our histories, our educational systems, our housing systems, and labor market systems and so forth in the context of a class. And how do you compensate for effort when, fairly, and those kinds of questions, I think are just, anyway, front of mind. The other thing I'll just I'll emphasize and then I'll stop is I love the question, and I want to look up your earlier work on this, Marta, about the tolerable limits of inequality and the tolerable dimensions. And it reminds me of John Rawls' kind of philosophical work and others who are like, what is the minimum, the maximum minimum of injustice and so on. But we need to, I think, revitalize that conversation, in part to push back against the indifference to injustice, and indifference really to the distribution of injustice is what I think people are profoundly numb to. So much so that we see these moments when people perceive the distribution to be off and respond to that more so than the injustice itself, as when, the white motorist is pulled over and the police officer reassures her in Atlanta, I think it was, "We only kill Black people, don't worry," meaning to joke, he says. Or when defendants in court say that or elsewhere say that, or the insurrectionists from the Capitol say that they're not engaged in a terroristic activity. That distribution of that idea is off, and we need to go back to this. So I think the point about reframing, which relates so much to Rob Nixon's intervention with slow violence, is the point about reframing is key. And I think as this point about societal convulsions or inflection points go, the pandemic is undoubtedly creating both the necessity of reframing and unique opportunities to reframe that I think are really important, in the sense that we know that history kind of moves in circles, and we can anticipate backlash. We can anticipate retrenchment and redemption and so on. But if we can make headway in reframing and creating new categories of and relationships of understanding and so on, I think we are more resilient as those cycles go.
Well, as we saw from Keith's presentation, demonizing immigrants as agents of infection is an old trope in the Western world, going way, way back. It's racist, of course, but Governor Abbott's charge that the immigrants are bringing COVID across the border is not only racist, it's opposite of what happened. The COVID epidemic got going in the United States first, and because we have this massive deportation regime and we put people in cages, and these people are ones that work in food processing plants, in hospitals, and service work where they're in contact with people, we basically created a pipeline to export COVID into Central America and parts of Mexico, contributing now to their high levels of COVID infection. So it's not only racist, but it's opposite of what really happened. We were the ones that were the infectious agents. And
that's why I raised it, Doug, because these days you assert something and then it just grows legs and wings and it takes off. And that regime of facts versus misinformation is something that affects all of the discussions today. And that's why I raised the question about evidence-based decision making. Are we really going to go back to that, or continue to perpetuate whatever we want to make up?
Yes, and one other thing I'd like to note is that one thing we've learned from cognitive psychology is that there's this thing called loss aversion, and human beings hate losing things that they've been accustomed to having. And we know that psychologically, experience of loss is far more painful than the pleasure you get from an experience of gain. It's completely disproportionate. Mm. And I think what's driving a lot of American politics now is loss aversion on the part of white males, because their relative status has gone down. In 1970, when I graduated from high school, I entered a labor market where most of the jobs were reserved for white guys. African Americans were segregated and out of sight. Latinos were regionally fragmented and not visible. Asians were less than 1% of the population. Women were still in the kitchens. And that's the world that's gone. And I think that's driving a lot of the animus in the U.S. population today. But I see with Keith's talk a hope for reframing, because one thing a good epidemic does is it crosses a lot of lines. Class will protect you, but race doesn't necessarily protect you from COVID and the side effects of the COVID epidemic. And what you're seeing now is a lot of white people getting hurt and out of the labor force and finding their jobs gone. And all of a sudden, these government interventions, all of a sudden, government's not the bad thing, it's a good thing. And there's huge support for this $1.9 trillion plan that drives up the budget deficit. And it's very popular among low-income white people. So it's a chance, and because the high levels of unemployment in manual jobs and the high levels of infection in manual jobs, it shows you that it's not just hard work that is going to get you ahead. It's where you are in society. So I think there is a chance for some more progressive politics moving forward, and I think Biden's tapping into that, and we'll have to see what happens. So I'll open the floor to anyone who wants to speak, and if anyone listening out there wants to send in a question, they can use the Q&A function, and I'll ask on behalf of you. So any further reflections? Keith, you look like you might want to say something.
Yeah, I had a couple of observations, and maybe one in more hopeful vein as well, which is that, there is an interesting way to interpret the convergence between the pandemic and the election, and also the sort of demographic transformation of the American population. And I was wondering maybe if that's not a good direction to go in, given the fact that we're talking as by way of the Office of Population Research. And a lot of the politics of race and the politics of social inequality, certainly through the Trump years and leading up to it, was about this kind of resentment about white people becoming someday, in a predictable future, a minority within a country of other minorities. And it's not, I didn't invent this way of, interpreting that a lot of the kind of the politics of whiteness and white resentment is shaped by that. And the reason why I'm putting this out is that, in some ways you could read the 2020 election as a revisiting of this question in the context, add pandemic and mix. And in some ways it really was an election that hinged more on the question of social inequality than any national election that I can think about, because it was such a bald feature of the Trump agenda. Now, it hinged on a lot of other things too, but the idea that you had like a January special election in Georgia where questions of social inequality were like absolutely central in Georgia. And so the idea that, yes, it was I could say this with assuredness in retrospect, right? Because we know how it turned out. It could have gone a number of different ways. But in a sense that, like, we have the legislation that Biden is signing today, it's a byproduct of this national conversation about social inequality. So I really do feel like, I'd much rather be having this conversation than the conversation we were having a year ago, which just on the question of like race and blame, one of my colleagues who does the history of Chinese medicine pointed out in this really wonderful observation that, you had a lot of different ways of being racist about the Wuhan virus. You could either see it as the product of a primitive, quote unquote, wet market in Wuhan, or the byproduct of a hyper sophisticated biological laboratory in Wuhan. And both of them were projections of this kind of nemesis of the Chinese. Trump was far less nuanced about it. So it's an interesting place to be this year, right? So we have the after effects of, but I'm just wondering how you think about the broader demographic story of the American population and its politics, and what that suggests about, like, will this resentment, right, which is very, very much part of the politics of the last 4 years, how long will it persist, and how will it continue to impact these questions about how we deal with social inequality?
Well, Marta, you're the past president of the Population Association of America. You can take on the demography.
Well, let me just say that you're absolutely right, Keith, to raise this point for the following reason. When Bill Fry published his book and called it Diversity Explosion, right? What does that do? Explosion. We did that in the 60s with population. The population explosion got people all riled up, all kinds of commissions trying to implement birth control, et cetera. Now, diversity explosion, where they're looking, suddenly Hispanics became a race. So you can't be white anymore. Even though the Census Bureau says Hispanics can be of any race, and many people are mixed races. And so that's really what you're trying to do is actually, that's the measure of integration on the one hand. On the other hand, the fact that the pure whites, whatever that is, no longer exist, actually feeds this narrative. And I think that's one of the problems. Dal Myers, I have spoken up on this in all kinds of meetings where I see these things presented. I said, wait a minute, if you use the same data and you classify it this way, you allow Hispanics to be white if you're looking at race, or you get a different answer, but it doesn't matter. The narrative has already grown wings. And that's one of the problems. The other one is, so that's one narrative that's moving in the direction of the polarization. On the other hand, I'm heartened by the business community. I serve on a corporate board, and I read all the diverse corporate governance responsibility committees, and I read those blogs regularly. And it turns out that all the big business community are now tying CEO pay to inclusion. The social environment, governance, and social. The social has come into sharp relief in the business community in a way that's saying this is no longer possible. We're going to tie CEO pay to inclusion policies. You got to demonstrate it. You got to document it. So there's a shift in the other dimension among the power elite. How it's going to manifest itself trickling down into social behaviors, I have yet to see. But if change begins at the top and the tone is set at the top, there are some heartening moves in that direction. Representation, whatever you want to call it. So I'm hoping that takes hold. At the same time, what happened in Georgia is really interesting. What happened in South Texas is worrisome. You have the Latino vote actually going for Trump. It's the male Latino vote shifting toward Trump. And that is a first, and it's a worrisome development, more for men than for women, but it's non-trivial. So there are a lot of cross currents here that are linked with the changing demography of the population, tied with the stratification, the levels of education of Latino men in South Texas, and what's happening at the top. It's hard to predict from that, but I want to focus on the signs of hope, and that's what's happening in the business communities.
Jeff, for Matt.
Did you say Jeff or Matt? I didn't hear what you said.
I said Jeff or Matt, yeah.
Oh, I did want to jump in quickly if I could on 2 points. One is this very interesting and I think encouraging finding in the legacies of racial violence research, which showed that this paper by Ryan Gabriel and Stuart Tolnay looking at histories of lynching as they relate to homicide, which has been one of the relationships that's been shown. Contemporary homicide, particularly Black victim homicide, is significantly been shown to be related to histories of lynching, net of other factors. And what they showed in this study was that that this relationship is mediated by white political behavior at the county level, and such that in counties where populations did not vote for George Wallace or Strom Thurmond to invoke in earlier elections, the relationship between lynching and homicide goes away. And the mechanisms are not clear, but one interpretation of it is essentially that the society, rather than tilling the soil again to support structural racial violence, structures of violence, and so on. This is when the society moves in another direction, and particularly when the white polity moves away from a kind of white nationalist frame of that there is some change that takes place that can be helpful, and of course we'll be able to replicate that study using recent elections and to test whether those patterns endure. The other thing is about blame, and I wanted to note that I'm drawing in my comments on Michael Rothberg's work on his book recently, The Implicated Subject, where he writes about structural inheritance as relates to histories of violence. And what he's really attempting to do in this work is move us beyond this binary of victims and perpetrators, so that we understand ourselves collectively as, this is another one of those reframing moves, collectively as implicated subjects, implicated by virtue of the fact that we are enmeshed in structures and institutions and webs of ideas that are the product of history and that literally shape us, shape our identity, shape our communities we live in, shape opportunity structures, and so on. And I think that move is critical for us now, because we really require, he describes this as in some other parts of his work as well, as creating possibilities for long distance solidarities across difference that otherwise become quite difficult, particularly when we're stuck with this binary of victims and perpetrators and the sort of blame question that it raises.
Matt?
Yeah, I guess one question then, so Jeff, how do you make sense of that kind of trend in parallel with the rise and also the very fast rise and equally fast fall of support for Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen? Do you see it as a historical aberration? Do you see it as a bigger shift, or do you see it as something that kind of, maybe in Keith's telling, was forged uniquely in the context of the pandemic?
Well, I don't think this way of understanding the world has been taken up widely. I think we remain very much in this polarized, us and them dynamic, and in the Black Lives Matter movement was so quickly absorbed and sort of articulated in relation to this notion that it is a movement for them against us. I mean, it's so I guess maybe I'm curious about the extent to which the movement can be understood to have declined. I imagine there are polls and so on that would show something about that. But when I think about the tremendous generative force it has been in terms of how the organizational developments that have grown out of it, the mobilizations across sectors, and geographic and globally, I think it is still very much alive.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, Joe. I agree with that. I'm sorry to be misstating. It was kind of a question of the broader support in the American public, including the white American public, rose quickly for Black Lives Matter, right? And stayed up, and then kind of fell by like 20 points after the election. And it's an interesting thing to get my head around, at least from a historical perspective, and in terms of the things that you're challenging us with today. I also have to leave in a few minutes, guys, to go teach. I'm sorry.
If I could just one last thing about that, I would attribute that largely to the caricaturing of the Black Lives Matter movement as, a terrorist movement, as a mob, and also I think probably the desire among many, particularly white Americans, to get all of this behind us, to move on, in the wake of the election, to kind of close it up, like I was describing before. We do, right, rather than kind of sit with it and process and incorporate. Holocaust scholars write about the importance of incorporating the trauma in the culture itself, and we don't do that. We like to seal it away, and so I think that's I would imagine that swing is in part related to that. But I'll stop, and I'm going to respond to one of the questions in the chat about, through the chat, about this article I just mentioned, because I do want to share that work.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. I would be interested to hear reflections on the strongly gendered social and economic consequences of COVID. We've been talking a lot about race and class, I think, but there's obviously a gendered perspective as well.
I can start. I think the evidence is overwhelming that women have taken the bigger toll. They're lost in the labor market. We're way back to, we've lost decades in terms of women's participation in the labor market because women have been doing the schooling. What I didn't show you was that of the more advantaged kids who have good tech at home, they are more likely to be supplemented by a parent's resources and instructional time. But if you're instructing your kids, and if you have multiple kids, then that makes it very difficult to also be in the labor force. So that is something that's going to have a very long tail. The question is whether the women who have withdrawn from the labor market will return, number one, and number two, whether there will be a penalty for their a career penalty for having left the labor market. So I think that's really powerful. The other one is there are many women who lost jobs, Black women and Latinas, who were in the informal sector, who are working as domestic workers, because, especially initially when COVID hit, like New York shut down, many domestic workers, nobody wanted them in their home. I mean, there was a case where somebody said you had to take a bath before you could walk into their home, and they gave them gloves and all kinds of sprays. It was just, there was a lot of misunderstanding, but the toll was quite disproportionate on women and women of color in particular. But this one hit women in higher education, better educated women as well, because they took on the role of supplementing instruction at home.
Any other takers? We have one more question. David Grusky, in a recent op-ed, proposed the idea that the equivalent of a GI Bill and veterans benefit for healthcare providers and other essential workers who've risked their lives for us during the pandemic as a way of compensating them to address their racial and ethnic inequalities. But I was wondering, in addition to that visionary proposal, if you all could explain why they think market wages are not rising more for many such critical workers like substitute and full-time teachers due to the remarkable labor shortage we're starting to see in education and other sectors.
Well, that is a really good question. The teaching profession has been really undervalued for quite some time. My cousin, my nephew just moved from California to Tennessee, and he was making, he had a job in a private school doing very well. And one of the job offers in Tennessee for an experienced counselor with masters and all kinds of credentials was $30,000. Now there's a problem with that. Now that it is Tennessee and the cost of living is lower, but that is a real challenge. So the idea where seniority comes in, the teaching profession is also highly structured so that merit and duration and seniority oftentimes are the ways of compensation, but it doesn't transfer across locations. The substitute teaching issue, some of the things I was reading were really surprising. They were really they said, okay, we're going to raise the dollar, the amount you're paid per day, from 50 to 55 or 60. They were just very modest increases. They weren't getting any takers because the places where they needed them more, where the teachers were much more likely to be absent more frequently and longer periods, were precisely those schools they didn't want. Middle schools in inner cities where the children are, where the youth are quite problematic, and therefore they would rather not work at all than to take those minuscule wages. So the solution has been to downgrade the credentials, and one place was offering high school to teach elementary school. To be a substitute at elementary school. And that really is unacceptable. That is really diminishing the value of teaching and the experience and that's required to do excellent pedagogy. So that's a second issue. There has been some, I think, the lack of union mobilization, although Amazon is now facing some movements, and there may be some movement in that direction to try to raise the wages of the so-called essential workers. But those that are undocumented or that are relying their delivery people, I don't see how they can possibly be organized unless they organize. And on the one hand, I'm encouraged that there are some organizations that are gaining momentum. My other nephew in Los Angeles has been very actively involved in getting the minimum wage passed in Los Angeles to 15 an hour. On the other hand, if we think back at what happened with the top 1% and the protests that were in Washington Park in New York, and that was a really interesting movement. But then they tried to become all things to all people, and as the winter set in, that they broke up. So they didn't have the leadership to carry the banner forward in the same way that we saw really strong leaders in the civil rights movement. It's a long slog, and the attention span seems to be less because there's so many competing alternatives, and the pandemic did not help.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'll let people make any final reflections. Keith, do you want to have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly go on forever because this is just an incredibly generative conversation. I wanted to make a couple of just closing observations. One about Jeff's really helpful use of Rob Nixon's slow violence, because I do think that the pandemic is as devastating as it has been in terms of health and certainly mortality. And certainly in terms of social trauma and loss of life, and I could go on, has this kind of sad and tragic silver lining in the sense that it has taken conversations like, for instance, in the slow violence, we understand that asthma is a byproduct of the social location and the design of cities and has implications for poor people and Black people in cities. COVID-19 has just driven that point home. So it has essentially taken a set of premises, a set of understandings about vulnerability and made it unarguable and crystal clear. And so now we can have a conversation about what public health should look like going ahead. Similarly, Marta used the phrase essential worker. Well, essential worker is a category that now a new social type around which we can begin to have discussions about social policy. So before we would talk about migrant workers, or we might talk about meat packers. Meat packers weren't even on the agenda for public conversation. But now essential workers are in league with police and firemen. And when we talk about who gets vaccinated first, whose health matters, right? We've pushed now, this is a really major step. And my sense is that, there are many people who are going to be tweaking the meaning of these terms, but the term is here and it has, to go back to the phrase, reframed the conversation in a meaningful and positive way. I have lots of observations about, Jeff raised this great question about how to understand the coinciding of social unrest with epidemics, right? And how you can understand kind of 1919. And it works in a lot of different ways, but my interpretation of the convergence between Black Lives Matter and the pandemic is, I mean, it's very timing specific. That is to say, you have an already existing jobless inequality crisis for Black people. You have a pandemic that highlights universal vulnerability on health, that isolates people and throws people out of jobs. And then right at that moment, when you also have new evidence showing the disparities, early disparities along lines of race and COVID mortality, you get George Floyd's murder. That happened like in the space of, a few weeks. And so if you want to understand, I think, the catalyst for Black Lives Matter and why it took off, it's really, would it be important to kind of understand that sequence of developments that sort of lit a match that well, I'm mixed metaphors here, but kind of, that then resonated out into many other communities. So great conversation and much more to say about the intersections between social inequality and the pandemic.
Marta, final thoughts?
Just that teachers are now essential workers in some places, not all, which I think is also an interesting proposition in terms of the queue. So that's going to be quite consequential going forward and opening because it ramifies on thousands of kids and future generations.
Hey, Jeff? Yeah, thank you again. This has been really wonderful conversation. Two quick things. One is to the question of gender. I want to reinforce the importance of talking about masculinity as it intersects with race and ethnicity and class, and particularly white masculinity as a element of the story here. And also I'm curious about, which relates to Jacob's question, I think, about the labor market. How will we come out of this in terms of the way we think about household labor as essential work and how we think about and support high quality childcare? Will we move away from this model where it's commodified, a private market for high quality childcare? There's been some move, I think, in that direction. It seems to have stalled, but it's important for women and men and others, and lastly, on a related point, I'm just thinking about Henry's question about the substantive versus the symbolic. I sort of read this story as an iterative one where there's a kind of path dependency, and Keith's points just now were alluding to this, where one move opens possibilities for another, and I'm not ready yet to conclude that the symbolic measures will not translate into substantive change. I think that part of what the symbolic measures are doing is creating new kinds of understanding, new vocabularies that become the basis of substantive changes. And it's worth noting here, and I'll stop, but it's worth remembering that it wasn't long ago, to remember the title of that the state of the nation was such that many people talked about this as being a post-racial society and a society where we were colorblind. And so it seems to me clear that we're not going back there. And I think that's a good thing. And where we're going from here is less clear, but that seems to be an important break.
Well, on that semi-optimistic note, I will conclude the session. I want to thank our interlocutors and thank the viewers and thank the Office of Population Research for putting this series together. And there'll be another one forthcoming in May that we'll put out on the airwaves that you'll soon hear about. So thank you, everyone. And on that optimistic note, let's close. Thank you.
Doug.